So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marguerite Klein, and I'm here on behalf of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which I co-chair with Professor Dennis Shields in the School of Medicine. We're delighted to welcome you all here to this event to mark International Women's Day. And we're really pleased with the interest in this event. However, before we get on to the event, and again on behalf of the committee, we want to acknowledge within the school how much we all have faced challenges and acknowledge the pressures that we're all undoubtedly feeling at the moment. We know from a professional perspective that all the staff across the School of Medicine, our professional and support staff, our faculty and our adjunct staff, as well as our students, have all risen with incredible energy and enthusiasm to the immense challenges that COVID has presented to us in the last year. And we've had to rework everything from our teaching, from the university perspective, and the learning from the students' perspective. And we thank everybody for all their extraordinary efforts. And so onto the business of the afternoon. So we're here today to mark International Women's Day. The theme this year of which on a global basis is Choose to Challenge. A theme chosen to highlight that a challenged world is an alert world, and from challenge comes change. So this theme tasks us all to choose to challenge and help forge a gender equal world where women's achievements are celebrated, awareness is raised against bias, and action to promote equality for all is paramount. However, as we know, gender inequality does still exist, and we see evidence of this in our everyday life. It was only last week that we learned via parliamentary questions that 4 out of 10 of the government's cabinet committees do not include any women in their membership. And following its formation last June, the government established 10 cabinet committees on COVID-19, economic recovery, Brexit and the North, the environment, housing, health, social affairs, education, Europe and government coordination. But there were no women on the cabinet COVID-19 committee, the cabinet health committee, the committee on Europe or the committee on government coordination. And unfortunately, this confirms a history of underrepresentation by women in politics and further exposes underrepresentation in the senior civil service. However, this is just one example from one sector. We've heard recently about the lack of female representation in the media. And it highlights our responsibility to keep asking why women are being excluded like this and whether that's acceptable today in our society, which obviously is half female, because these committees are powerful decision-making entities and implementing decisions for the whole of society. So hopefully, in contrast somewhat, the School of Medicine, in tandem with the university, is dedicated to the promotion of equality, diversity and inclusion, or EDI as we say for short. Certainly women in medicine are making tremendous strides and are coming to the fore more and more. We note Catherine Moore has just recently been announced. She's been appointed as the first neurosurgeon in Beaumont, appointed, and she was one of our graduates in 2006. Today on the news, we heard Linda Mulligan talking to Brian Dobson, and she's recently been appointed as the chief state pathologist, again, a graduate of UCD in 2002. In our EDI committee, we recognise that we need to create both a work and a study environment where everyone, regardless of their gender, is able to reach their full potential. And the responsibility for that it rests with all of us actually, and how we approach our work. And we are proud to promote and maintain both a welcoming and safe work and study setting where there's mutual respect and dignity for all. And the school is also committed to both meeting and exceeding our EDI related obligations under current legislation by doing actually more than what is required by law. So in light of the university's strategic aims around EDI and the global theme for International Women's Day, we chose the importance of female leaders in a COVID-19 world as the title of the School of Medicine event to mark this day. Just to quote the words of Michael D. Higgins, who said today that COVID-19 has brought unprecedented challenges to citizens around the world, and it is women who are carrying the greater share of its economic and social consequences. So in a few minutes, my colleague, Dr. Fiona McGillicuddy, will introduce you to our guest speaker and interviewee that we're delighted to have here today, Dr. Gabrielle Colleran. And again, on behalf of the school's EDI committee, we're really excited about this event. So Fiona is going to discuss issues such as work-life balance, COVID-19 childcare related challenges, COVID-19 related issues in the healthcare system, the absence of women in COVID-19 leadership roles, and the challenge of engaging women in leadership roles and achieving those leadership roles. So as you listen to the conversation, you can also post questions on our webinar Q&A feature. And we'll put these to Gabrielle at the end of the session by our two facilitators, both Dr. Derval Adooley and Dr. Lily Lee, both members of the EDI committee as well. So Fiona, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks a million, Marguerite. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today to talk with Dr. Gabrielle Colleran on her journey to leadership in medicine and to explore the current barriers for women entering into leadership roles and then tips for how to enter into leadership roles, especially for all our students attending today's session. So when we were brainstorming on who to invite today, Dr. Colleran's name was the first name that came to the table, and we were so delighted that she was available because she's been an absolutely amazing female leader during the COVID-19 pandemic here in Ireland. And this is particularly notable in an era where the female voice has been notably absent both from the airwaves as well as the political high tables, as Marguerite just alluded to. One only needs to watch a couple of minutes of interview with Gabrielle to recognise that she's incredibly passionate about transforming the healthcare system here in Ireland, both for the healthcare professionals as well as for the patients themselves. So we're excited to talk a little bit about those topics today as well. So by way of introduction, Dr. Colleran is a Galwegian. She did her undergraduate degree in NUI Galway. She did an MD in breast cancer genetics and cancer research UK. She then came back to the basic surgical training in the Western training scheme. And from that, she went into radiology training in the Mater Hospital, and she did PEDS training in Temple Street and Crumlin. And from there, Dr. Colleran then moved to Boston's Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School for a couple of years. And she was promoted to Chief Fellow in her second year there, which was really her first engagement into leadership. So hopefully you'll talk a little bit about that today and how you achieve that, Gabrielle. And it was during her time in Boston's Children's Hospital where Gabrielle started to subspecialize in fetal and neuro biology. So Dr. Colleran returned to Ireland, thankfully, and now holds a variety of leadership roles, which I'm going to have to take a moment to read because it's so impressive. So she's currently a consultant radiologist and the radiology lead at the National Fetal MRI Programme. She's head of Department of Radiology at the National Maternity Hospital. She's consultant paediatric radiologist and clinical lead for paediatric radiology education at the Children's Health Ireland at Temple Street. She's a clinical senior lecturer for paediatrics in TCD, and she's also an assistant clinical professor in women's and children's health here at UCD. On top of all of this, she's the vice president of the Irish Hospitals Consultants Association, and she's a major advocate for healthcare professionals, for patients, and for equality in patient care. So she's does a lot of outreach. You do a lot of media work. You've 12,500 followers on Twitter, and if you don't follow Gabrielle on Twitter, you should. She's brilliant. She also writes a column for the Medical Independent. And on top of all of this, she's mum of 2 young children. So what an incredible career trajectory to date, and you really are an inspiration for everyone here today. So we're really looking forward to hearing more from you. I'm just going to channel Tommy Tiernan today and ask the questions. So without further ado, let's get going. My first question, Gabrielle, is just to talk a little bit about your journey to leadership in medicine. And particularly, were there any like milestones or special training that you did along the way that were instrumental into you entering into a leadership role?
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks for the lovely and very generous introduction. I guess, you know, my clinical training prior to going to Boston was very much focused on like learning about pathology, learning about radiology and, you know, clinical medicine. And then when I was in Boston, I was very lucky in 2 aspects. One was that in my second year when I was Chief Fellow, they gave me a protected academic day with time with a research assistant to support me. So I had time for academics, and that was really brilliant, having that protected time. And then the second thing was that I was selected to do a course in leadership for fellows over that year with other fellows at Boston Children's. So we were taught a structured curriculum around leadership theories, strategies, and that was really the first management and leadership training that I had had. And it sort of opened my eyes to the potential. And I was very aware that I was at the stage in my career where I had a really good understanding of radiology in terms of the diagnostic clinical part of the job, but, you know, running a department, managing a team, all that interpersonal part, I hadn't had any formal training until that point. And I really, like, the course was brilliant. The people leading it were really inspirational, and, you know, we had to do quite a bit of background reading with it, and all of it just opened my mind to kind of the possibilities around the transformation that can come with, you know, great leadership. And so that really like stimulated my interest in it. And then when I came back to Dublin and took up my job, I was replacing Veronica Donoghue, who loads of people on the line would probably know, who had been the head of department in Holles Street for 30 years and like the leading figure in paediatric radiology in Ireland to that point. And I was really conscious that, you know, I felt like I really needed to work on those tools around management and leadership. And it just happened that the HSC, that year that I started as a consultant and as head of department here in Holles Street, we're running a course on executive skills for aspiring clinical directors. And I applied and I sent like a pleading cover letter saying, I'm a new consultant, I'm head of department in my first role as a consultant. And you know, I could really do with the learning from this course to help me in the role, because 2 things that really struck me when I came back, I should say, Fiona, and this is kind of sobering, was, you know, when I was away and I was learning all these evolving techniques, cutting edge improvements in radiology, and I couldn't wait to get home and implement them and bring that knowledge back. But then when I got back, I was really struck by the waiting list. You know, I was talking about, you know, advanced 3T MRI for epileptogenic foci in kids. But we had kids with epilepsy, you know, waiting years to have their MRI study because of our waiting list. So I was struck that, you know, me having all this knowledge and ability to provide a high level of care, if that wasn't accessible for the kids, well, they were getting really limited benefit from me having those skills. And then the second thing was around equipment. You know, our fluoro machine in Holles Street when I came back was already well beyond end of life. And it was on the list for replacement by the HSC. And they're great in HSC procurement, but they should get funding every year for all the machinery that's going out of date. But there's never enough funding for all the machinery that's due to be replaced. So you really have to fight and keep doing your business case and your risk analysis to get those things done. So I was really conscious that I needed help on getting those skills around the management speak as to how to advocate for my department, for appropriate staffing, appropriate equipment. And that course that I was lucky enough to be selected for, you know, there were 35 consultants on it from all around the country, different disciplines. We got amazing didactic lectures, but we also did quite a bit of small group work together where we brought our various issues and then we problem solved together. And the collegial relationships and the friendships and the support that I got from the people that I met from around the country at that course really was probably the catalyst for me getting involved in, advocacy and medical leadership, because it gave me the confidence to say, well, there's a lot that needs to be done, and I can't look around and wait for somebody else to do it. Everybody's busy, nobody has time. So what am I going to do? What am I going to take responsibility for? And I think between the fellowship course, the leadership course in Boston, and the executive skills between HSC and RCSI, those two things were the springboard for me to step up, because I think we all have that inner voice that says, oh no, there's somebody more qualified than me, not me, someone else. But those two courses really taught me a lot about myself and gave me the confidence to say, yes, I can bring something to the table and I'm going to give this a shot.
And how did that end up with you moving into the vice president of the Irish Hospital Consultants Association? How did you end up there? It's such a senior role.
I guess like we're talking about equality and representation. I've experienced direct gender bias and then a bit more subtle implicit bias at various stages in my medical career. But I've never experienced that in the IHCA. So the first meeting that I went to was in the Burlington about 3 years ago, and it was a closed meeting and there were a couple of hundred consultants in the room. And towards the end, I asked a question from the floor and I was pretty passionate about it and I was advocating strongly. It was around, what were we going to do as an association to ensure that we had safe staffing levels and that we would attract the talent back from abroad that was staying away. And afterwards, Martin Varley, who's the Secretary General, came up to me and said, you spoke really well. You're clearly very passionate and interested in the issues. We need more young consultants. We need more women. We have vacancies on council. Please tell me you'd be interested. He said, I said, one of your friends is already involved. I think you know Laura Durkin, who I did know, and he was a good friend of mine. And that was really it. And I have to say that being involved with it has been a really positive professional and personal experience for me. And within the organization, both myself and Laura have been given huge latitude to pilot ideas and strategies and different things. And it's always been pushing an open door. If anything, I'd say I've faced positive gender discrimination bias within the organization, that they've been so supportive. And so I was on council for a year, and then I was asked, would I go for vice president the following year, which was a very pleasant but sort of unexpected surprise. And so now I'm a year and a half in the role now, so I'm quite used to it. But it's a challenging role. We're a diverse group, as consultants, and you get a lot of feedback that's robust. But that's, I've grown a lot and learned a lot from that too.
That's brilliant. I just think it's so impressive. There have been some incredible examples of really effective female leaders during the COVID-19 pandemic. Is there anyone in particular who's inspired you, and what qualities would you value in a leader?
Oh, that's a good one. In terms of political leaders, for me, Angela Merkel in December was pretty exceptional. And I think it probably struck a chord with me because we were having similar conversations in Ireland, but she was getting lobbied quite strongly about reopening the country more over the Christmas period. And I don't know if you saw the clip, but like she addressed the nation and she said, I know everybody wants to have big family gatherings, people want to see their loved ones, but the reality is the spread of COVID is too high at the moment. We've done the modelling. If we do that, if we open the country for these family gatherings at Christmas, we will have too many excess German deaths. And I know it's hard, I know we all want it, but the cost is too high. Too many extra people would die, so we're not doing it. And for me, it was very much that sense of she was taking the harder road and it was coming at a personal cost. She was taking the hit for it because she was the person saying, no, you're not having that experience that you want. But she was doing it because she knew the cost would be so high. And it was, leadership for me is about doing the right thing. And like, if the right thing was easy, everybody would do it. And sometimes with hindsight, we can forget the struggle that it can be to do the right thing when the social mood music isn't actually in keeping with what you're doing. And so for me, that was really brave. Jacinta Ardern as well, I know everybody says it, but either it doesn't ever look like she's playing politics, and maybe she's so good at politics that it just doesn't look like it, but it just always seems like, and I'll give away my own demographic now by saying this, but like in Frozen 2, she just does the next right thing. and so it really just feels like she's like, right, this is the right thing to do and we're going to do that. And then she just keeps consistently doing that. And, you know, as a country, and they obviously have certain geographical advantages, but I think they really benefit from the fact as well that she's very much led by her public health experts. So, you know, we see that consistently with women, that collaborative, inclusive leadership that recognizes other expertise, you know, gives it the platform and then makes those holistic decisions that are inclusive. Within the medical community, for me, Catherine Motherway in the first lockdown was a pivotal moment for the country when she went on the television as the lead for the ICU community to say, we need you guys to stay at home. We want to be able to provide care for everyone that needs it in ICU. But for us to do that, you have to do your bit. Yes, this is hard. Yes, this is scary. We're able, for what's coming our end, we need you to do your bit at the front line. We're the last line. And for me, she demonstrated such compassion, such understanding of the challenges for people, but yet, you know, she really demonstrated that leadership and that ownership of what needed to be done in a way that was really unapologetic. She didn't ask for permission. And I love that. I love when I see women owning their own power, when I see anyone owning their own power in that way and being unapologetic, not asking permission, just saying, this is the way it is. And she didn't scaremonger people. She was really calm. And I felt like we were in really good hands having this person leading the ICU community at that time. And it was wonderful for me also that she was a really senior woman in what is a male-dominated field. So those three probably particularly stand out for me.
That's brilliant. I think, you know, we can see from when I read your almost resume there, you have a lot of professional roles and a lot of responsibilities, as well as having 2 young children. So I'd love to just kind of touch on the topic of work-life balance. So how is that for you?
So I'm not a model for work-life balance, just to say that straight up, because I have too much work and not enough family time. But that's something that I'm trying to work on, because but I think what I will say is that when I'm in work, I try not to feel guilty about not being at home. I try to just focus on what I'm doing. And I try to do the same thing, that when I'm at home, I'm just trying to enjoy being with the kids, family time. I will say it's probably a bit harder to not let the work time creep into family time, especially since, you know, so many meetings, so much has gone online with COVID. I have found it harder to leave work at home. But I'm very passionate about what I do. And so I really enjoy my work. And so as a result, I don't feel like it takes as much mental energy as if I was doing something that I didn't enjoy. But what would make my work-life balance a lot better would be if we had enough colleagues, you know, like across the Irish healthcare system. And I'm sure you've probably heard me talk about this before, Fiona, but like we've the lowest number of consultants in Europe, 20% of the posts, like 728 not filled. That has a huge impact on the way we work. So if I contrast it with when I was in Boston, you know, my colleagues that have stayed there, they're on a 1 in 22 on-call roster. They actually don't do overnights because they have in-house consultants on call that just do nights. Whereas here, you know, I'm on a 1 in 6. So I was on call for the weekend, you know, leading right into this, a normal work day today. I'm, you know, doing this with you. I'm doing the Tonight Show later on this evening. It is very hard to juggle all those competing needs. And so the best way that I can address it really is by campaigning for those better working conditions. And so I have found my role in the IHCA very fulfilling in that, because I know that I'm doing too much. I know that I'm not getting enough family time or downtime. Just like all my colleagues, I'm not exceptional by any ways in that, but I also know that I am speaking up on it, and I'm speaking up for patients around access. I'm speaking up for colleagues who are abroad that don't want to come home because they know they'll have a way worse work-life balance and be more likely to be burnt out. And we've actually done some burnout research among consultants in Ireland that we've just had accepted for publication. So I can't say it now because it hasn't gone out yet. But unsurprisingly, like the burnout levels are like worryingly high, and that has huge impact on retention and recruitment and on patient safety. But because I'm working to address that, that gives me a certain amount of sustenance around keeping going. And the other thing I would say is that within my circle of like the women that are my like core group, I tend to surround myself with strong women who really fight for what they believe in and are very passionate and generally positive, like solutions oriented. So like Helen Heenan, who's my best friend from college, who's now the professor of surgery at UCD, you know, like everything, you know, everything is an opportunity and a challenge, you know, like literally a rock wouldn't knock her down, you know. Laura Durkin, who's, you know, my friend who's rheumatologist at the moment, exactly the same. Like whenever I have conversations with these women, I feel energized and positive after it. So I think that kind of outlook does probably help, because when I was listening to you listing off all the stuff I was doing, I was going, God, that sounds exhausting, but it doesn't generally, you know,
I think, you know, we were discussing before, Gabrielle, you know, when you were in Boston, you had a bit of protected time to do research, which of course is important for clinicians to also progress in an academic manner. How has the lack of that time in Ireland affected you? Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah,
because you do research. Tell us about that.
So like in Boston, I had a protected day, and then I had like a research assistant that supported me when I was doing presentations. So from that year, with that one day, I got 6 papers, 3 of which were in paediatric radiology, which for us in paediatric radiology is our journal. And so then when I came back, you know, all my hours are clinical. So everything I do is, you know, on the couch after the kids have gone to sleep, in the evenings, on the weekends. Now, I've still managed from that to do pretty well. Like I've had 7 papers accepted in the last 6 months, 2 of which I'm first author on, and 1 is an international collaboration around fetal MRI, which is my passion, so I'm like very proud of that, and 2 of which I'm last author on, which again is like mentoring the next generation, so another stage of my career. But I know that if I was part of that network like I had in Boston, where I had that protected academic time and those supports, I could do so much more. And I'd say that for a lot of my colleagues across, you know, the healthcare system, that if we had that bit more time, that bit more protected time and academic supports, we could really do a lot around innovation. We're already like well punching above our weight, considering that we know that we don't have it. And I mean, I got a small grant last year, but I could do a lot more if I was part of a network. And so that contrast with Boston, where I had that support, is very, very marked.
I know. I think it's incredible to hear someone say that the work-life balance is better in Boston than in Ireland. And I think that's true for many in the medical community, that the work-life balance in Ireland.
No comparison, Fiona. So like we had a subsidized creche at work. So I brought my daughter with me, dropped her to creche at 6:30 in the morning, was at my desk by 7, picked her up at 6 o'clock, went home, had the evening with her, you know, and get her off to bed. And then, you know, sometimes I'd have to log back in to finish something remotely after she was asleep. But I very much felt like, you know, my family time was quite protected. And then because I had this protected academic time, I could get so much done on a Thursday, which Thursday is still one of my favorite days because it was like protected time, you know. So yes, it is interesting. And so you definitely have to work a lot harder for it here. Like, and you know, I am also conscious of not wanting to miss out on time with my kids because they're only small for this time. So like fitting things in when they're asleep or doing other activities.
Hard. And I guess on that note, the next topic is around, you know, managing childcare during COVID-19. So I think it's kind of fitting that International Women's Day falls on the day that our daughters are back in Montessori and I'm back in the office for the first time in months. So how I just, you know, I had them home with me full time and was trying to work full time, but I can't even imagine what it's been like for healthcare professionals. So can you speak a little around that? How are you? How did you survive? How are your colleagues? What could we have done differently?
So I think, you know, when we look forward to how we build forward from COVID, as opposed to building back, but building forward, one of the key lessons for us is around representation, because we, you know, we just don't have enough women at the decision-making table. So decisions that disproportionately affect women and children, we've seen that impact in the quality of those decisions. So, you know, I'm in a group of healthcare workers and we were chatting at the weekend on WhatsApp around it. And our big fear is that there'll be a 4th wave and we'll again be left juggling and told to improvise. You know, healthcare workers in the north, their children went to school. You know, children of essential workers were supported with schools so that their parents could continue to go to work. And that didn't happen here. And so people were just left to juggle. And where it was, you know, a 2-parent healthcare worker family, people were trying to stagger shifts, one go in early, one go in late, but it caused huge pressure. And at a time when, you know, we were just starting vaccination with this 3rd wave. So we had people out with COVID, people out as close contacts, people out with symptoms. And then we had a bunch of people who, because of a lack of support from the state with backup childcare when kids weren't in school, couldn't be available for work or were having to do it in a modified way. And so I think one of the key learnings is we could do that a lot better. And I'm a little bit self-conscious talking about childcare as a women's issue, because we know it should be a parent's issue. It's not a women's issue, it's a parent's issue. But all the research tells us that women disproportionately carry that burden of care, whether it's childcare, whether it's elderly relatives. And we're seeing that, in the research looking at the, the impact of women in academics. I think I was reading there last week, 500 hours on average, lost to women versus childless men in academia. That's a huge impact. The University of Liverpool, men were actually up by 11% in grant applications, women down by 20%. So that has, unless it's addressed by universities, unless it's addressed by, funding bodies like, Science Foundation Ireland, that will have an impact on women's career progression, potentially for years, if men get to, jump ahead of them at these key points. And so again, it comes back to our society building forward in a more equitable way that's more inclusive and diverse, and that, takes systemic action to address these things.
When we talk about the potential fourth wave, God, please don't happen. Just, I don't know if I can take it. What measures are you trying to put into place at this point for healthcare professionals with, say, the government? Is there any initiatives ongoing?
So I'm part of a group of women in COVID Women's Voices who have been, quite vocal on calling on the government to engage with and listen to female expertise on these areas. What I'd love to see and what we'd love to see is a plan for a fourth wave that includes backup childcare options if schools have to close again, not just for children of healthcare workers, but also vulnerable children and children in special needs schools, because we know that these children are, every child is disadvantaged when schools close, but vulnerable children and children with special needs are even more disadvantaged. And for children with special needs that regress skills-wise, some of them will never gain those skills back. So we're looking at real long-term impact. So that's what I'd hope to see, learning from the first three waves and then saying, right, we're going to do it better next time. And it really is about stakeholder engagement. I was listening to Dervin MacDonald held an event about the importance of hearing women's voices in the media with RCSI last week. And Susan Smith, who's a professor of general practice in RCSI, and who's also involved in COVID Women's Voices, she had this, she said this, and it was really profound to me. She said, decisions are being made in a gendered way without discussing with the women affected. And I was just listening going, wow, that's really it. Because no matter how well-intentioned people are, if you don't have representation of women by women, the issues that disproportionately affect women and children won't be dealt with as holistically and inclusively as if it was led. And that applies not just to women, but to all groups, travellers, Black people, people with disabilities, the LGBT community. So what COVID has done is shone a light on systemic inequality within our society. Poorer people have had a much worse COVID. There's a reason the rates of COVID have been higher in Darndale, higher in Blanchardstown. People living in more cramped accommodation, needing to take public transport, doing high-risk, low-paid jobs where there isn't necessarily sick pay, so people are under pressure to go into work. So when we look to, what do we want our society to look like after COVID? I don't want to go back to a society where hundreds of thousands of people are on waiting lists to see a consultant because we don't have enough consultants in the system. We're the lowest in Europe. We don't have enough beds. I don't want to go back to a society where children are born into direct provision and are growing up thinking that that's normal. Where children are born into homelessness and thinking that homeless hubs are normal. It really frustrates me when as a society we kind of wring our hands about the Magdalene laundries and we look and go, God, that was shocking. But then we're actually actively discriminating against, people in right now, and our children will look back and they will be like, just shocking that you didn't address this. And, whenever I actually say this, in media, that for me, direct provision is just the same as the Magdalene laundries, I get horrible letters from men to my email, to my place of work in Temple Street, to the IHCA offices in Dundrum, saying this is totally inappropriate. But for me, it's not actually, it's this generation's Magdalene laundry. So the question is, Now that COVID has shone a light on inequality in a way that means it's inescapable for us. Like if people could have said, well, I didn't really know it was that bad before COVID-19. Now we all know, so we don't have plausible deniability when our daughters come to us in 20 years and say, Mom, what did you do? What did you say? How did you speak up and be an active ally? Because just saying something on Twitter, but not following it through with action in real life, like that's performative. That's not real. Like you actually have to follow it through with saying, you know, I'm not going to sit on this panel unless there's a traveller woman, you know, unless there's somebody with disabilities, unless it's really representative of the inclusive society that we want to build.
Powerful, powerful. I just think that, you know, we're coming to the point now about like, how can we actively engage females into leadership? So interested to hear your thoughts on that.
So while we're still talking about like media and representation, Women on the Air is a fantastic organisation, and Noelle O'Reilly was a panellist on that RCSI webinar that I was talking about, and she was saying, you know, women are 51% of the population, but we're only about 25% of the representation in media. So when politicians are socialising legislation, when they're making these decisions, if women aren't represented enough at that stage, that has effects then into how the legislation is actually written. So Derval MacDonald was saying that like she really wanted to see government and funding bodies actually making it so that those bodies that are funded by the government have to track gender balance, measure and monitor it and report it, because we've seen that that works. If we look at Balance for Business, like representation of women on boards has gone up by 18% to 30% in 3 years, with organizations in business having to track female representation. So put the onus on media to include female voices. And then within that, as women, and I'm conscious that like as a medical consultant, I'm a privileged, educated, middle-class woman, then I also have responsibility to say, well, you know, don't just have women like me, include that broad cross-section of society so that traveller women, women with disabilities, LGBT community, Black women, that, you know, the panels are as representative and inclusive as the society that we're living in now, because that's how we improve the quality of decision-making. In terms of then getting women comfortable with stepping up into leadership roles and into speaking in media around their expertise, I think there's a body of work around it. Like one thing I've noticed is that whenever I suggest somebody like to replace me if I can't do something, like sometimes women will be too exacting of themselves and say, oh no, I'm not the exact expert on this. And Ruth Freeman from Science Foundation Ireland was saying that there's this kind of fear of the peer, you know, that people are afraid to speak on something unless they're exact expert. Like men do not have that issue. Like, I mean, I think we could all name off a couple of men off the top of our heads who might be a scientist or a doctor, and they will speak on anything, even if it's nowhere near their area of expertise, with real confidence, like too much confidence. Whereas women will tend to either not want to do it unless they've had loads of time to prepare and research, or, you know, want to give that opportunity to someone else who they feel is more expert. So I think there's a bit of work we can do within the universities, within the training bodies around communications training and getting people confident. So like I will often say, you know, to Matt Cooper or to Pat Kenny, whoever, you know, I'm not a public health specialist, and Marie Casey would be the best person for you to ask about this. But from what I've read, my own opinion is X. Or I'll say, you know, I don't know that question and you should address it. And I'm now really comfortable saying, I don't know, and not being forced into saying something that I'm not confident about the accuracy of, because I'm very cognizant that when I'm making a contribution and when I'm speaking in media, it's a real privilege to have that opportunity. But with that privilege comes the responsibility to be constructive with it and to be, you know, making a contribution that helps to educate the public and to support them around public health messaging and understanding, and not sensationalistic. And so it can be a challenge at times, because sometimes, depending on, you know, what show you're on, the presenter might want to get that soundbite that will be provocative and attention grabbing for their for the profile of the program. Whereas I'm always trying to keep it, well, what's constructive around public messaging? What can I do that will, you know, be positive, like, and make a contribution that has meaning and value for the general public.
So important. I think, you know, you're touching on some very important points there. So for the next generation of leaders who are on the call today, what are your top tips for them, especially around media and communications?
So Women on the Air run courses around media training and communications training. Now, I haven't done them myself, but my friend Sarah Fitzgibbons, who's the founder of Women in Medicine in Ireland Network, which I would recommend all the medical students and NCHDs on the call definitely join. It's a wonderful organisation. She has done it and speaks really highly of it. So that's an opportunity. So take any opportunity to get media training, and then take those opportunities to do the sort of less stressful opportunities. So I would have started off doing some of the smaller radio shows, you know, things that aren't as high stakes as Prime Time or Claire Byrne or The Tonight Show, where you really are like in the spotlight. So building up your confidence with those exposures. And then in terms of leadership in general, I think mentorship is really important. And so like in my career, I have really benefited from strong mentors, female and male. Like I've had some very good he for she mentors. You know, Stephanie Ryan, who is a paediatric radiologist in dentistry, has been a great mentor to me. Rona Mahoney, who was the master in Hollis Street when I started, was extremely good to me when I was a novice, you know, very enthusiastic, very well intended, but, you know, very green. Fionnuala McAuliffe, who is, you know, one of our lead MFMs in Hollis Street, and obviously, you know, professor in UCD as well, really encouraging and supportive of me as I'm sort of trying to build an academic network, build an academic profile without having an academic appointment. So Fionnuala is someone who I would, you know, very much call on and, you know, bounce ideas off and get advice as I'm trying to advance things. So I think, you know, identifying strong female leaders who you've seen deliver themselves, and generally they will be very positive, get up and go, and seeing challenges, not seeing problems. And then also paying that forward yourself. So like, you know, I have 3 people that I'm now mentoring at the moment in paediatric radiology, and so it's really nice to be sort of part of that chain. You know, you have the mentors that help you, and then you know, Black women will talk about, you know, lifting as we climb. And I think that's very powerful, though. I did see a sketch recently where someone said, like, even bodybuilders don't lift as they climb, like one at a time. Which is, but I do think the metaphor is quite powerful, that sense of, you know, you don't want the door to be opened just for you and to be the token woman in the room that ticks a box, because that doesn't deliver systemic change. You know, if we want things to improve for women and for everybody, and it's almost strange in the way that we're having this conversation, Fiona, because women are 51% of the population, yet we're still a minority group that's diverse because we're so underrepresented because of the systemic inequality and patriarchy that's built into the system. So if we want to improve things for our daughters and for our sons, because, you know, inclusive, diverse societies are more innovative, everybody can be themselves when we actually have true equality and equity in our society, we have to address the systemic factors that are holding women back and that are, you know, impacting equal representation.
Gabrielle, that was fantastic. I'm very conscious of time, but otherwise I could talk with you all day or so. I'm conscious that we've got some questions that have come through from the audience. So Dervla, do you want to pop your camera on and field the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Thank you very much, Fiona and Gabrielle, for what's been a super interesting conversation. And I'm sure we could continue on for a long more, but I guess in the interest of time, we should probably move along. And we have some really interesting questions that have come in from the audience. And I'm really excited to say that I think a lot of them have come from med students, which is fantastic. So perhaps I'll just go with the first one because it's following up just on what you touched on in relation to mentorship. And we've had a question from a student, probably from an international student, who has asked if you have any tips on actually on getting a mentor and what advice you might give in asking for a mentor, specifically when you're moving to a new country, because you've had an experience of this during your time in Boston, because they're so important for career development. If you have any advice on that, on how you would approach a mentor, I guess, and ask if they would assist.
Oh, great question. So I guess my own personal experience of it is when you arrive in a new department and you're going to be there for 6 months and a year, give yourself a couple of weeks to take the temperature and start to see who you think will be a good fit with you. Because for a mentor-mentee relationship that you want to last over time, there does have to be a certain element of a personal connection, that you like the person and they like you. If you sort of fundamentally don't click, then the relationship isn't going to be rewarding on both ends. And so when I was in Boston, you know, the first few weeks I was sort of watching out, you know, getting to see the different consultants. And then there was one consultant doing research in something that I was really interested in. And so I approached her, and it was quite funny with hindsight. She said, let's talk about this again in a few weeks. And so I said, okay, fine. And then 4 weeks later, she came back to me and she said, yeah, no, you're a good worker. So I'm happy to take you on. But it was like, you know, she wasn't going to commit to me until she was sure that I would produce. And so we've gone on now we're on our 4th paper together. And so we've produced 3 papers together, and we just really click. And so that then has meant that working together has been fun. So I think looking to see who do you click with, and then that you're interested in the work that they are doing, and so that you can fit in with it. I do also recommend checking people's outputs before you commit to them, because within that same department, there would be a few people who I wouldn't have wanted to do research with or be mentored by, because they wouldn't have been productive. You know, they would do a lot of talk about work, but when it came to actually, you know, mucking in and getting the work done, they wouldn't have been as proactive. So I would also recommend asking people who have been there before you. Now that's harder when you're coming to a new place and you mightn't know anybody, but finding out from people who's good to work with and who puts the time in. When I came back as a consultant, I actually asked Stephanie Ryan, who I mentioned earlier, to be my mentor. And this was kind of a new concept to her. So I explained, you know, what I would be asking of her and what she would be asking of me. And she has really taken to the role with gusto. And so every so often she'll call me into the office to say, now in your role as mentor now, I want to discuss this with you. And so that's been really lovely for me. And I hope it's been fun for her too. But that's what I would recommend. One of the things I will say as well, that there's a doctor on Twitter called Uche Blackstock, and she talks a lot about health equity and, you know, her experience as a Black woman in medicine. And one of the things that she raised, I think about 2 years ago on Twitter, was that people tend to mentor people that look like them or that are from where they're from. And that made me really uncomfortable. And I found myself thinking, well, do I naturally tend to go towards the women who are from outside Dublin? And when I looked at people I'd mentored, I was like, actually, I've done that quite a bit, because being from Galway and then making the transition to Dublin, I knew that it can actually be a little bit tricky when you're not in that UCD, Trinity or CSI axis where people know each other. And so I made a conscious effort then to seek out international registrars who were in radiology and, you know, ask them, do they want to do research? Because they tended not to ask as much as the Irish registrars. And so I don't want to say too much because I don't want to identify the person, but I've had I have a really fulfilling ongoing mentorship relationship with an international registrar. And it was only through mentoring her that I realized all the challenges that internationally graduated doctors undergo when they come to Ireland. It is so much harder to get on the register for the Medical Council. It is so much harder to progress through training. And so it has been a humbling, but also infuriating experience seeing the additional challenges. And she's one of the most brilliant radiologists that I've ever met. And you know, working with her in research was such a pleasure. You know, I'd send her an edit, and the following morning, late at night, and the following morning she'd already have done what I'd have asked her. And so, you know, we published a few things together, and we're still, she's now no longer in Ireland, but we're still in a lot of contact and still working together. So sorry, that was a very long answer, but I hope you got it.
No, absolutely not. That's fantastic. I mean, I think you make such good points. As a fellow Galway graduate, I completely empathize, and I can only imagine what it's like coming from abroad. You know, it's definitely challenging. So thank you very much for that. We have another great question from another med student who says, I was wondering, were there any times where you doubted yourself or your character when speaking up as a student in university throughout your career, or did you ever have a fear of sounding bossy?
So that's a great question. You know, I'm one of 5 and I have 3 older brothers and an older sister. And my dad would be the first feminist that I ever met. And he was really strong about wanting myself and my sister to have the same opportunities and the same achievements as my brothers. But he was also really strong on how it's more challenging for women, and that I would have to be consistently better because of the systemic discrimination. And he and my mom really believed very much in all of us, and would have very much raised us with this sense of, you know, you treat everybody with respect, you are kind to people, you are respectful of people's time, but also that you know your own worth, and that you don't let people talk down to you either. So I probably haven't experienced like feeling like, no, you know, I don't feel like I can make a contribution on this. I think probably because of growing up in the household I did with the parents that I did.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Another more general question next. What advice would you give to medical students regarding how to be heard and how to lead in a career in medicine?
Oh, so this is a great question. And I do think, and I can only speak for when I was going through medical school and I graduated in 2005, we really didn't have like any training around like leadership and management. So I'm sure that's probably different in UCD and probably different in the schools now. But I do think that, you know, there's a stream that is not something you should be doing in final med, but built across around communication and communication with the public around, you know, things like, you know, true PPI, where we have the public involved in planning the research. We're doing all those things. We're becoming more aware now of the importance of two-way dialogue as opposed to one-way dialogue. So I think there needs to be more of it taught, and I also think it needs to be examined. Like if things aren't on the exam, they don't tend to be valued. Like we know that from research. So I do think, and communication skills, obviously everybody has different innate levels of, you know, communication, but there are also skills around it. So last year I did a great course with a woman called Kathy MacDonald online. Her company is The Art of Communication. And I was telling Fiona about her. She's a really interesting woman. She's a former hostage negotiator, and now she teaches communication skills. And she's just incredible. I first saw her at the RCPI in 2019, and it was just a masterclass in communication and difficult conversations. Because one of the challenges in medicine is, you know, when something is challenging or when somebody is behaving badly, how do you address the issue without destroying the relationship going forward? Because with many people, you'll have an enduring relationship over years. So yes, there's this issue that you need to address now, but there's the other issue of an enduring relationship that needs to work for patient safety at like a basic level. And so Kathy's course actually really taught me around the importance of keeping the other person's dignity at the center of every conversation. And that I have found really helpful. So whenever I'm giving somebody feedback, especially if it's feedback that might be hard, you know, when people are underperforming or not doing what they're meant to be doing, you know, those are hard conversations. You know, people talk about the sandwich and, you know, sometimes there's just meat, like there isn't bread. And so those are really tough conversations. But if you come at it with the lens of, how can I keep this person's dignity at the center? How can I prioritize the relationship and channel the communication around it? That really helps. So I guess to come back to the original question, I think taking every opportunity for training and communications is really important. And then working on developing relationships with mentors who you can learn from in seeing how they role model that behavior. And if you happen to be one of those lucky people who knows what you want to do, trying to identify a mentor early so that you can be developing your research portfolio in that area with people who you'll be working with in the future is really helpful. I loved everything in med school. So when I was in OBS, I wanted to do OBS. When I was in PEDS, I wanted to do PEDS. So I did not know what I was going to do. So if you're one of these people listening going, I have no clue, well, you know, join the club and you'll still work out fine.
You heard it here first. Super.
Ellen always wanted to be a surgeon. I don't know if she's on the call or not, but always.
Fantastic. We have a couple of questions related to career development and having children, which I think is a really good one. So perhaps I'll just pose the first one. So as a female medical student who one day might be taking maternity leave at some point, how do you play catch up when competing for positions with men who don't necessarily have that to factor into their career path?
Oh, so I'm going to be really controversial now, just as
Please do.
So I would love to see a situation where there is paid parental leave for men that is equal in duration to women. And I think until we have that, we're still going to have the issue of women being discriminated against because of the potential for them to take maternity leave. And, you know, so that's what I would love to see. Now, I wouldn't like to see them say, well, the current maternity leave, we're going to slash that in half and give, you know, half to dads and half to women, because another area I'm very passionate about is, you know, breastfeeding and supporting that for women. And so women really need the leave that we have to, you know, to make that relationship work. But I would love to see that, because I think that's the key thing, because this medical student has nailed it on the head. When you have two people of equal caliber and the woman is of childbearing age, people generally don't say it straight out, but there is implicit bias in the system, and we see it from, you know, how men progress. You can see it in academia. So I think that has to be addressed. That same question mark that hangs over women needs to hang over men, and that's when we'll have equality. So equal paid leave for parental leave is what we need. In terms of, people often do ask me for advice around when to take maternity leave. And I generally say, look at the obstetricians. They all have their babies as NCHDs. Why do they do that? They know that the longer you leave it, the harder it is, the more potential for difficulties. So have your babies early. There's no good time. I had a baby as an NCHD. I had a baby as a consultant. Yes, it does impact. Like if you PubMed me, you'll be able to work out when I had my babies, because 2 years later, there's no publication, right? But, you know, it is a relatively short period of time. As it stands, you know, the question is, how do you catch up? It is hard to catch up, because, you know, the work of care does disproportionately impact women. All the research shows that. But I feel like personally, I'm definitely a better doctor and a better person for having become a parent. I'm way more tolerant of other people, and I also pay way less attention to small superficial things that might have frustrated me. You know, I don't have the time to be thinking of those things, but maybe that's just me.
Probably have lots more patience as well,
yeah.
Gabrielle.
Definitely. And there's definitely some skills with toddlers that you can bring into the workplace and apply those same techniques that work really well. But I do think fundamentally, like we're joking about it, but to be serious, it's at a systemic level that has to be addressed, because as long as people look at a woman and they see maternity leave and they don't look at a man and see paternity leave to the same extent, there will continue to be discrimination against women, and it will impact leadership roles in medicine and in science across the board.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Gabrielle, for your very honest answer. And just following up on that, then, somebody is curious about your support that you would have had yourself personally, whether from a partner all along your career trajectory, and how you managed with your children.
So this is quite funny, because my friend Anthony O'Connor, who's a gastroenterologist on Twitter, himself and myself and Laura Durkin were chatting one night, and he said, do you ladies know that when you put your names into Twitter, the first thing that comes up is husband? And not Twitter, into Google. And I was like, no. And then I type my own name, and sure enough, you type in Gabrielle Colleran, the next thing that comes up is husband. And then the next one I think is age. So it shows you the stuff that people are searching. So, so my husband is very private. So he doesn't tend to like me talking about him or being specific about the kids. So I'm not going to say much, but, you know, I think, is it Sheryl Sandberg that says, like, the most important decision a woman can make, you know, is like the relationship she chooses to be in. And so support is key. Like, there's no way that I could do what I do, or, you know, if I didn't have good support. My own parents are dead, which has definitely like impacted. My mom was incredible to my sister, like a really good support around childcare and backup when kids were sick or couldn't go to creche. So I definitely miss having that broader network. But my sister is great to me. My sister-in-law is great to me. And my husband is great. Like, we are co-parents. And I would love to see, you know, that in general across our society, that when we're talking about childcare, that we're talking about parental issues as opposed to just women's issues. But because in some ways, if we as women take ownership for the whole problem, we're almost kind of buying into the patriarchal assumption that it's a woman's issue and not a parent's issue. But then on a pragmatic level, you know, we know that women are carrying this load. And what we've seen from this pandemic and how it's been managed is that if we don't actually take on the ownership and tackle it, it won't actually be tackled by the men making the decisions at the moment. And we saw that with the third wave, where, you know, childcare, school closures and healthcare workers were just left to improvise. And improvising was understandable in March of last year. It wasn't understandable 10 months later in January, when there was plenty of opportunity to make a plan. And they didn't even have to make their own plan. They just had to copy one that was working well in France or Northern Ireland or wherever. So again, we're sort of back to the key learnings that it is about representation. And I mean, if we look at the moment, the debate around Helen McEntee and can she take maternity leave? I mean, that just makes my blood boil. But in reality, you know, there should be a drop-in creche in the Dáil. So many of their debates are late at night. You know, if they're serious about parents, women, but parents, you know, becoming TDs and being part of it, you know, you have to build in the childcare support so that it's not impossible for people to do it. And again, when you make it that it's late at night and difficult from a childcare perspective, you're making it something that only people who have the money to pay for that additional childcare privately can do. So again, you're excluding people from poorer backgrounds. And it comes back again to representation, and that the laws that we make, you know, are, you know, more representative of the people who make them, because we all bring our own perspective and our own life experience.
One very quick kind of specific question, Gabrielle, in relation to anyone who has children who are already settled in school, who are on the BST, HST training schemes. Do you have any advice on how to avoid moving them around with various posts?
So this is really challenging, and I think this issue has become more prominent in recent years as we have more graduate entry medical students coming through, because of people being that bit older, we have more people who have families of their own and who have houses, and so the moving around makes it more challenging. I think there's a huge body of work for the colleges to do and for the hospitals to do around making that all more family friendly. Like, you know, Niamh Humphreys in RCPI and the Hospital Doctor Retention Project, they've done amazing work on why do doctors leave? And this issue of having 6-month rotations or 3-month rotations where people are in Dublin and then they're in Mullingar and then they're in Galway, it's really disruptive to family life. Now, when you go to look at changing that, you do meet quite a bit of resistance. And I've been in meetings where I have, you know, been on the sort of trainee side of this around flexibility, and people have said, well, we had to do it. And, you know, it's, you get a broader experience if you're doing more moving around. And I think it's really important to tackle that attitude head on. Just because we had to do something and it was really hard doesn't mean we then turn around to the next generation and go, well, I got through it, you have to. That's a really bad attitude. We should want to make it better for the next generation, not just say, I had to do this, so suck it up. So that's something that I personally get very exercised about. And it again comes back to systemic change, couples matching, you know, so that people can put in their preferences and have those preferences reflected in what they do. And of course, you know, it does have to be equitable as well, because on the other side of it, you know, people who don't have kids and who don't have families will say, well, why should such and such get priority ahead of me? And many people have responsibilities of care to parents or to other people that aren't necessarily children. So it is quite hard to be equitable, but it does, I think, all come back to capacity in the system, that when you have enough NCHDs, when you have enough consultants, you can build in more flexibility. And we need more less than whole-time equivalent roles, not just for women, but for everybody, because lots of people want flexibility for different reasons. But if you have enough capacity in the system, that people tend to be more flexible. My experience is that when people feel oversubscribed and that they're doing too much and they're stretched, when somebody says, I need a bit of flexibility, that can feel a bit too much. Whereas when people have capacity and have enough staff, they can be more accommodating. And, you know, that's what we want. Like, we are fundamentally a kind society, but I could give tons of examples from myself and from colleagues and friends where they have had really inappropriate things said and done to them by training program coordinators who were supposed to be advocating for them in these situations. And it can come back to that attitude of, I had to do it, so you have to do it. And, you know, there are more than one way to achieve that product of the qualified healthcare professional at the end. People don't necessarily have to follow the same path. And I think recognizing that there can be different paths to yours is an important part of the learning that I have come to in my career. You know, my path has served me really well, but other people don't have to validate my experience by repeating it.
Absolutely, completely agree. Okay, so we just have, I think, time, in the interest of time, we have 2 really short questions that we'll try and just get answered really quickly. Do we have time? I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah.
Okay, one rather interesting one. It's quite long, so I'll just read it out. One thing that I've noticed throughout medical school is how women's health is constantly brushed over. For example, drugs that are contraindicated in pregnancy always being a side note, and how little time is spent on educating students on topics such as menopause and menstruation, etc., things that are guaranteed to affect 51% of the population. Do you think in order to achieve equity, including beyond gender disparities, we're looking at major changes in the infrastructures of education?
Oh, it's a great question, isn't it? And I mean, research would back this up. And when we see this, when you even look at research and the funding that is put into men's issues versus the funding that is put into women's issues. And I get very agitated around breastfeeding and the lack of support for women, because I really do think it's around bodily autonomy and supporting women's rights. But if men breastfed, there'd be a huge amount of research putting into supporting them and them achieving their goals. Whereas with women, the research goes into formula, like an alternative. You know, it's my friend Robin Powell, she says, it's like if someone says they want to work on their backstroke and you say, why don't you just cycle? But they asked you for help with backstroke. You should be helping them with the backstroke. And so men get help with the backstroke and women get told to hop on a bicycle. And so it really does come back to fundamentally the patriarchal systemic discrimination that is built into our system. And unfortunately, when we look back in medicine, you know, medicine and medics have played roles in many of the scandals that have affected women in Ireland and across the world, you know. So we do have to get uncomfortable and look at our own history. But it's very true what that medical student has said, you know, women's issues not getting treated with the seriousness that men's issues are, and it being attributed to women being more hysterical or more emotional, whereas men's symptoms being taken as real. And so that is a fundamental question about how we approach research concepts and how seriously we take women's issues and how we fund them, because it does come back to tracking, tracing, measuring, because you need the data to then inform how policy changes. But I get really enthused when we have these conversations with medical students and with NCHDs, because I see the next generation coming up really not tolerating it in a way that even my generation, we're still a tiny bit apologetic about it. So I love seeing, you know, even the tone of that comment, you know, it's so unapologetic, and I love that.
Absolutely, completely agree. It was a fantastic question. And very thought-provoking, I think.
Oh, we could keep going for hours.
I'm going back to revise my my module.
Okay, so just to wrap up with the final question, I think it's, will I ask the final one, Marguerite, or do you want to leave it there?
Really quick question.
Okay, really quick question, just because it kind of comes full circle. Throughout COVID, we've seen lots of spreading of misinformation by people in leadership positions. When this is done by women, do you think this can be damaging to women in STEM?
So it's a really interesting question, but I'd say I've seen a lot of misinformation spread by men, and it doesn't seem to have done any damage to men. You know, so I've been shouting at the TV a few times recently where male scientists and male medics have made comments outside their areas of expertise that have been very inaccurate. I hope not. And my general experience is that women broadly are very responsible in how we communicate. And if anything, we hold ourselves back because of fear of being inaccurate. And I think getting more comfortable with saying, I don't know, or saying, you know, the best person to ask would be this, or my personal opinion is this, but I haven't had sight of the most recent research on why, is a good position to come from on that. But I'd be worried of buying into that narrative, because that's the kind of narrative that can make women afraid to speak.
Wonderful. I love that. Thank you very much, Gabrielle, for answering those questions. And I'm going to hand back to you, Marguerite.
Okay, Gabrielle, that was just absolutely fantastic. Really thought-provoking, not just about medicine and women, but about society overall. And, you know, how everybody, again, comes back to this thing, absolutely everybody has to play their part in equality, diversity and inclusion. And you're certainly doing your bit. And I think the questions there were really interesting. We've gone over our time, and we really appreciate all the time you've given us. And we appreciate now, after hearing about all the things you do, how precious your time must be. So we're really, really grateful to that. You know, you really showed us, you know, that we should have confidence in our abilities and be able to find our road to success. And finally, to all our participants, we hope you all enjoyed this meeting, and we look forward to welcoming you to other events that the EDI committee will run, and looking forward to you playing your role in supporting us. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. We really enjoyed that.
Thanks so much, Marguerite. I really enjoyed it.